going to talk about the user experience process, the process of designing a user experience, and all the different variations and possibilities on that. Now, this is yet another area of controversy because people tend to feel really strongly about the process by which you go through doing this and which is the right process and so on. I will share with you my thoughts, but basically I want to kind of walk through what the different varieties are that you might find out there, whether you're, again, someone who's looking for a particular job in UX, whether you are a product manager that wants to bring UX or expand UX into your product design. It's useful to understand the process, what's critical in the process, and the different kind of flavors and varieties that are out there. So let's first talk about what I think all the different processes that are out there, what they have in common. So what's really critical if you're going to do UX? Why do you need a process anyway? Well, here's the thing. There's so much going on when you design a product. You know, there's what the business owner's trying to get out of it. There's the whole technology. There's the developers. There's just a lot of pressure when you're working on developing a product, whatever the product is. And it's really easy for the design of the user experience, the way the user is going to interact with that interface. It's easy for that to get lost. If you don't specifically say, we are going to design the user experience to optimize the experience for the person who's using it, it'll be real easy for all these other competing points of view about time and about budget, about technology to take over. And for that idea of having a great experience to get lost. And when that happens, you end up with a product and you get it done. You get it done on time and on budget. And it's a terrible product and the users don't want to use it. And your competitors have a much better user experience and you lose out. So if you want to design a great user interface, you have to have a process by which you do that. And you have to then attach that process to all the other activities that are going on. So that's what we're going to talk about. So what is involved? What's an effective process have? Well, no matter which UX process you use, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the various ones, all UX processes have some things in common. There's some amount at some point of user research. Now, this is actually very controversial because there are some types of UX processes that say, oh, you don't need to do all that. You don't need to do all that. Well, you have to do some at some point. So we'll talk about how these different flavors of processes bring in user research and how much they do. But at some point, you got to know who's the target audience, what do they want to do, and what's the context. Whether you do that in 5 minutes or whether you do that in 5 months, you got to have some of that information. So all UX processes at some point have the collection and use of some amount of user research. All the processes at some point have the idea of prototyping and sketching and iterating design ideas. They vary on when that is and how long that takes, but they all have this idea of iteration, of creating an initial design, being willing to change it, getting some information, some feedback on it, and iterating the design. All of them have some amount of collaborating with others. They usually all have some amount of getting feedback from the target audience and collaborating. Some of the processes have a lot of collaboration with the target audience. Some have at least getting some feedback. And there's collaboration with stakeholders. There's collaboration with the programmers and developers. And so the idea of collaborating with others is part of all of these UX processes. And then the last thing I think is really critical for an effective UX process is someone has to be in charge of the user experience. Well, of course, you say that's what a user experience professional does. But sometimes, not as much lately, and more in the past, but still sometimes I see this. Sometimes UX is seen as something that someone else can add on. So you have perhaps a programmer or developer, they're writing code for the product, and they get assigned to not only write the code, but also to care about and do some of the user experience work. And I'm going to say that that doesn't work. And the reason I'm going to say that is that it's a lot of work to develop the product and do the coding and development and software technology part. And it's a lot of work to design the interface. And those two are not exactly the same. And when push comes to shove, the design part often is the part that doesn't get enough attention. You need someone on the project whose role is to care about the user experience, worry about the user experience, advocate for the user experience throughout the project. Now, if you are if you're a small company and you have several projects and you can't afford to have a UX designer full-time on every project, I understand that. A lot of UX designers work on more than one project at a time. And so let's say you have 3 projects going on and one UX designer. Well, that one UX designer can work on this project some of the time, that project some of the time, that project some of the time. So I'm not saying that you need necessarily a UX designer full-time on one project, although that would be good depending on the project. But there needs to be the official UX person on that project, and their only role on that project is to do these UX kinds of things and to be concerned about the user experience. So those are the things that any UX process should have. Now I want to talk about some of the different types of UX processes that are out there and how they are similar and how they differ from one another. And I will tell you, there's controversy about UX processes. I think I mentioned that before. So some people feel very strongly that this is the UX process that must be followed, and other people have a different idea. Before I talk about the different UX processes, I want to separate out the idea of a UX process from a development process. And this is also controversial. So some people will say, well, you can't separate those, you don't want to separate those things out. So the UX process should be a very integral part of whatever process the software developers, the programmers are going through. And actually, I think the UX should be an integral part of the development and what the software is going through. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the two have to be totally married, and that you have to have a UX process inside your software development process. I believe it's possible to have whatever you want to have as your software process, and then to have a UX process and have the two work well together. But there's a lot of people that don't agree with me on that. But I do want to point out to you that the things that are important in a UX process are not necessarily, those things I just talked about, are not necessarily things that are important in the development process. So if you're getting swallowed up, if you swallow up the user experience inside the software development process, you may find that the UX people aren't there's not a place where they do the iteration. There's not a place where they do the user research. There's not a place in the project where they do the user testing, because that's not the same in software development. So I believe it's really important that you think of those two things as being different, and then they need to communicate with each other. Let's talk first about what is called Agile UX. So Agile is a software development process. And again, I got to tell you, I know there's some of you aren't going to agree with what I'm saying here, and send those emails in. I'm giving you my take on it from my years of experience. So Agile is a software development process, very powerful. A lot of people do Agile software development. And then you'll have a lot of people that will talk about Agile UX. And so what they mean by that, really, at a kind of a high level, is a UX process, a process to design the user interface that fits well with the Agile software development process. What does that mean? Well, everybody that I see that does Agile UX, that has a UX process that fits into their Agile software development process, they've kind of put together their own way of doing it, because the Agile software development process is so different depending on what organization you're in. At least that's been my experience. So whatever way they're doing Agile, then the Agile UX process has to figure out how to fit into that. So the idea behind Agile in general is that you break the work up. You're designing this project, you're designing this software, especially used for very large software projects, but even used for small ones. And it's a big, complicated project, and you're figuring out how to break that up into manageable bits, and bits that can be worked on independently. And the idea is that you want the UX work to be able to be done, quickly and iteratively in the cycles that the Agile software development people are doing. Now, I want to take just a moment and say that in the Agile world, and this is not a course on Agile, but in the Agile world, there's kind of the two main flavors. There's probably more than two, but I'll say there's two main flavors. One is called Scrum, SCRUM. The other is called Kanban. And these are different. Scrum Agile cycles are based on time, and Kanban is based on a cycle. I'm not going to go into any more than that, but just that those are kind of two different flavors of Agile. And the kind of UX process you would need to put together to fit in with those are slightly different. But in either case, if you are doing UX in a environment where the software developers are doing Agile, you are going to need to figure out how to fit into their time cycles or their project cycles. And you're going to need to be switching very fast, because they're going to decide now we're going to design this piece. And the piece that they're working on right then might have a user interface, a user experience, a user interface component, or it might not. I mean, they might be designing some back-end thing that the user doesn't use at all. Then you'll get a slight breather. But they'll decide, okay, now we're going to work on this, and there's a user interface component to that, and you need to be ready to go. So typically what Agile people say they want from the UX is they'd actually like the UX people to be a little bit ahead of them. So when they say, oh, now we're working on this part of the interface, the UX people say, aha, we've done a little bit of research, and we've done some planning and some high level ideas, and here's what we're thinking, and they're kind of ready to work. So in an Agile shop, the UX people need to be just slightly ahead and ready to go. They also need to, if you're doing UX in an Agile shop, everything is going to probably be compressed. So you're going to need to be able to do user testing really fast, and you're just going to be user testing a little piece, not the whole application. And you're going to need to have access to the target users you want to do the testing with really quickly. So you're going to have to plan that ahead. You're going to have to plan how we're going to do fast testing. How are we going to turn things around really quickly? How are we going to break things up into small pieces, because they're going to want to see just the interface for this part. Now, I have a strong belief that if you're doing agile UX, you can and should do a whole bunch of user research and high level planning and high level design and testing. You could do that up front. And this is where the controversy starts, because a lot of agile people will say, no, you shouldn't be doing any of that upfront stuff. You don't do any upfront stuff. But I think you could. I have experienced many situations where you actually have a UX team put together a UX vision and have user stories ready to go, and understand the users and context of use, and do a lot of work before the agile software development team even starts. Now, of course, that initial plan is going to get changed, but that's okay. They can still have it. But again, that might be somewhat controversial. So, agile UX means you've got to be ready to do things in short bursts, and you're going to be making a lot of changes and be hopefully 1 or 2 steps ahead of the software development team.